It's 6 o'clock, so we might as well begin. Hi, Duke.
Hi.
Ted, did you have any comments or suggestions, or we just dive in and?
Well, it seems like we've got a great set of questions, so
yeah. Okay, so why don't we just go ahead and do that?
By the way, Anthony was, I think, the odd man out last time. He asked a question, but it didn't get captured last time. So if he's got a question, we might want to let him go first.
Oh, that sounds like a great idea. Okay. There we go. Yeah. Okay, so is it Anthony, you said?
Yeah.
Okay.
Hey, can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Actually, my question I posted, it should be the second one this time, so I can just wait.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay.
Thank you, though.
How do I know when I've moved from stream entrant to once returner? Additionally, besides just continuously being mindful of aversion, craving, and continuing meditation, are there any other practices which help to accelerate the progression? Okay, so just to clarify, Anthony, you're speaking here in terms of the 10 fetters model, 10 fetters 4-path model, right?
Correct.
And so by that model, the criterion that defines second path is that that craving has become sufficiently attenuated, has lost its power to such a degree that you can proceed to systematically root it out in all of its forms, at least those having to do with the sense realm. So your question, how do I know when I move from stream entrant to once returner? Well, there is this sort of profound insight that characterizes these shifts in path. They're not necessarily highly dramatic, but they are consistent in that they produce a very recognizable shift. Now, what happens at this juncture between first path and second path that actually moves a person from one to the other is there is a really powerful realization that they have that so much of everything that they have ever thought, said, and done has been driven by craving in some way or another. Or sometimes this realization will take the form that that everything that they've ever thought, felt, or almost everything that they've ever thought, felt, or done has been driven by attachment to the self. And as you can probably see, these are really two different aspects of the same thing. If you, to the degree that you feel and believe that you are a separate self, then to that degree, you are going to, craving is the logical outcome of that. So there's this realization, and part of it is realizing that you have an attachment to craving, that craving itself produces a kind of pleasure, and that even though in the course of your work on first path, you have been at the same time harboring certain favorite cravings that you indulge in. I guess maybe the best way to describe the realization is that it becomes clear to you that the only mental states that have ever been fully satisfactory, in other words, truly free from dukkha, have been those when there has been neither craving nor any sort of attachment to the self. And so you realize craving as the enemy in a very gut level way. And you see through the delusion that has allowed you to persist in essentially tolerating the suffering of craving, the dukkha that comes from craving. That is where the power comes that defines you as second path. That power arises when there is this deep, deep insight that where you are is not good enough. As long as there is still craving and attachment to self, then it's not satisfactory. Stream entry itself, in my own case, it was like, wow, this is so much better than anything in my life has been before. I couldn't imagine anything better. So I didn't have a lot of motivation, but eventually I came to that realization. It was in a retreat, and it was following instructions to be mindful of mental states as they arise and pass away, and realizing that having exactly that realization, and this is the form it took for me, but in people that I discussed it with and do interviews with, it's a variation on this. I had the realization that that this wasn't good enough, that and that there was something much better yet awaiting me, and that I could see that the reason that the problem was the craving and the attachment to self. So this realization, this is really a deepening of the insights that brought you to stream entry. But with this deep insight, it craving loses its power, and so now you can begin to confront and root out craving. Whenever you're feeling the dissatisfaction, the suffering of dukkha, you know that there's craving and self-attachment. And so in a very mindful way, you can begin recognizing that, acknowledging it, letting go of it. And that is the practice that is the practice of second path. So how do you know when you've become a once returner? It's when you find that craving doesn't have the same power over you that it once did, because you see it as the enemy of true well-being that it is, and you have the ability and really the compulsion, the drive, a powerful drive to eliminate craving.
Is there a distinction in this framework between intention and wanting? Like, if I intend for something to happen consciously, is that considered craving?
No. It depends on whether the intention, where the intention comes from. I mean, intention is karma. Buddha took the idea of karma. Word karma means action, and it come to mean actions with moral consequences for the individual that performed the action. And the Buddha took that concept and found it to be a beautiful concept. But he redefined it. He said, when I say karma, I mean intention. And so you have both good and bad karma. You have both good and bad intentions, right? Mm-hmm. And I think we know the difference between good and bad intentions. The things that we use wanting for most common are bad intentions in the sense that they're rooted in self-attachment and some form of craving, desire, or aversion. That by themselves makes them unwholesome because they are increasing the power the craving has over you, and they are strengthening your attachment to the notion of self, the ego self. So whenever you're acting out of those kinds of intentions, or even holding those intentions, you're moving in the wrong direction. Now, there's an interesting thing about it, that this desire for self-gratification or self-protection is usually manifesting in some words or action that are in some way benefiting you at the expense of others, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, the two go together. The unwholesome nature of the speech and action is usually linked to its deeper sense of unwholesomeness, in that it has its origins in cravings and self-attachment.
Mm-hmm.
Likewise, what we would consider wholesome actions, generosity, altruistic behaviors, loving kindness, acts of compassion, these often are coming with a denial of our self-benefit, or at some cost to us, or at the very least, at no particular benefit to us. In other words, they're coming from a place of selflessness and denial of craving. So they're moving us in the right direction. So, yes, intentions can be both good and bad, and they are karma, and they are what changes who we are in the future.
So if I'm understanding you correctly, you would associate craving to low-level intentions, you could say, like low consciousness intentions. So would you say that one should just be aware of the purpose for their intentions and let go of those like low-level purposes for those intentions?
Yes. Yeah.
I understand.
Now, the simplest thing is you can just say, if I'm about to say or do something that's going to be harmful to somebody else, then let me look at my motives. If I'm doing something that's going to be beneficial to others, I look at my motives, and you can come to understand and you can learn this about yourself. It's a practice. It's a practice through which you learn to recognize your good and bad intentions. And then you can practice not following through and letting go of the bad intentions, and vice versa. But you don't get down on yourself when you fail. You just resolve to do better next time. Okay?
Great. Thank you very much.
One thing talking about this is, don't want to make it a pathway into any kind of self-blaming or anything like that.
I understand. Thank you.
Okay, so we'll go back to the first question. What is the most likely progression on the stages of awakening to expect in following TMI? Do most students simply go through them in a sequence, first path, second path, third path, or not? In my experience, that is how it happens, and the most likely first stage of awakening reported is stream entry. When you say reported, sometimes the person reporting it doesn't recognize it and realize what that is. But yeah, that's usually the way that it happens. Now, there is one thing I think, I'm trying to think where, probably should ask Valentino where this question comes from, but I'm going to try to speculate. There is one thing about path attainments and stream entry in particular, but it's true of the other path attainments as well, is that the initial effect is you often have the characteristics of a higher path than you have actually attained to. So somebody achieving stream entry, there's what I call the afterglow, which can last from hours to weeks. And during that period of time, the person often manifests many of the characteristics of a higher path, but they kind of come back down to what is their new normal, which is that of the stream entry. There's the reappearance of craving, and this craving grows stronger. If there was a persistent loss of the sense of self, then that's a really wonderful thing. Now you have an idea what it's like to be an arhat. But if you haven't gone through, if you haven't trod the intermediate paths, if you haven't undergone the transformations that they produce, then that quality that belongs to the arhat that you enjoy for a period of time eventually disappears. Okay? So I think that's where the question of, do the paths happen in sequence or not is coming from. Especially when somebody is referring to it in terms of the four-path model. Let's keep in mind that there are other maps and there are many other definitions of what awakening means, terms like enlightenment and liberation and things like that. There's a lot of territory there, and so it does kind of depend on which practices that you're engaged in, which belief system that you're operating from, and the form that will take. But in terms of the four-path, in terms of TMI, in my experience with people who practice with me, is that pretty consistently you've got to go through the paths in order. Some people can go through them very quickly. Some people have done so much work that they go from first path to second path, very quickly. Likewise, even to third path. So I hope that satisfies you, Valentino. I don't see you on a group, so I can't answer. Thomas, you're with us today? Maybe not. Okay, so Thomas says, a few authors such as Thanissaro, Biko, and Rob Burbea encourage adjusting and experimenting with the breath to allow for feelings of comfort, relaxation, joy, and similar positive feelings to arise. In TMI, you emphasize not trying to consciously change the breath. Could you please contrast the two approaches, pointing out pros and cons of each, if possible? Yes, well, I totally agree as far as generating feelings of comfort, relaxation, and joy, always a positive feeling in association with meditation. It's one of the best things that you can do to accelerate your practice is to enjoy it, and so whatever you do to achieve that. Now, adjusting and experimenting with the breath in particular, I wouldn't discourage somebody from doing that if they were a beginning meditator and they were having trouble achieving enough stability of attention on the breath to carry forward with the practices. So I don't think it's really necessary. I think that most people, if they look for the joy, if they try to make sure that if they take appropriate steps to assure that they found an appropriate meditation posture, if they learn to, whenever they're feeling discomfort, if they learn to recognize that there's also pleasant feelings at the same time, if they learn not to allow expectations to produce disappointment and frustration and other negative emotions, I don't think they need to adjust and experiment with the breath. But I wouldn't mind if a beginning meditator wanted to do that. I'd say, sure, go right ahead. But what you're really after is to get to a place where you are, as much as possible, the objective observer, and the breath happens by itself, and you're observing it. Because we're always trying to do. And one of the ways that we get in the way, get in our own way in meditation, is we try to do those things that we can't do, we can't make happen, that they happen because we relax, we do the practice, we trust in the practice, and lo and behold, we experience the results. Striving and trying get in the way, and manipulating. So my feeling in terms of the cons of adjusting and experimenting with the breath is it subtly feeds into that idea that there are ways that you can, that there's a you in control of your mind, and you can manipulate your body and manipulate your mind in ways that's going to make it easier, or make it allow you to experience the goals of meditation more easily. And that's not a good attitude. I'll tell you a funny story. At least I think it's funny. A very wonderful person, a student of mine, brilliant man, everything else, asked me in a class full of people, he said, sometimes I find in meditation that sexual fantasies arise. And these are much, much easier to focus my attention on than the breath. Would it be okay to use that as my meditation object? And, well, it led to a good discussion. But it's an extreme example of what a lot of people do. Try to find some way to make it easier rather than just relax, do the simple things that you need to do, and allow it to happen by itself. You don't try to make it happen. You don't try to invent a trick to make it easier. You don't try to manipulate things to make it easier. So if someone did use, was manipulating the breath in order to facilitate their getting into meditation, you know, that would be fine with me. But I would encourage them, as soon as you don't need this anymore, drop it, and I would caution them against the particular tendency that we all already have when we sit down to meditate, that it's reinforcing. So so being on guard in that way, then it becomes more. Then somebody can do it as more the way we use things like following and connecting to help stay with people. Edel Quinn has the next question. I assume that most of you have it in front of you and can read it. So I'm going to start with the second paragraph. Our understanding of the law of karma is that our actions in this life will generate good bad karma conditions that will ripen upon us in future lives, and that the purpose of karma is to encourage the practice of virtue. However, since you have taught us that there is no reincarnation, no Atman, no past, present, or future separate selves to inherit good, bad karma, then does a belief in karma provide any benefit or have any meaningful role in TMI? In other words, is a belief in karma among the rites and rituals of Buddhism that are to be eventually discarded? The attachment to and concerns about reincarnation and future lives are something that the Buddha actually cautioned us against. He said, don't worry about where you came from. Don't worry about what's going to happen after you die. Be concerned about your awakening in this life. Practice and follow the Dhamma in this life. He stood out. He was unusual amongst the many teachers of his time. And his teaching differed from theirs in a very significant way. He taught awakening in this life, that you can, that everyone can awaken within this life. All of the other teachers were teaching some sort of liberation, some sort of release from the wheel of samsara, from the endless cycle of birth and death and suffering that was going to occur after you died. The Buddha was teaching the path to awakening in this life and said, make that your primary concern. The other thing is that the Buddha recognized the ultimate law of causality, paticca samuppada, that cause and effect, that absolutely everything has consequences, absolutely everything is the result of causes and conditions, that everything is connected through cause and effect. Now, the pre-Buddhist and non-Buddhist, current non-Buddhist version of karma is a relatively simple one that says the only law is this moral law, and that the only form of causality is this kind of karmic causality. So that means that when there's an airplane that crashes, it has 350 people on it. Somehow the universe manipulated things so that all 350 people who got on that airplane happened to have the karma to die in the airplane crash. Or anything else any other situation that you can think of like that. The Buddha instead saw that there was a much, much more powerful use for karma. Yes, that kind of view, yes, I want a better life in the future, so I'll be virtuous. I'll try to avoid doing those things that are going to cause a poor rebirth. And I'm going to try to do those things that will bring about a fortunate rebirth. But he found that the basic principle that was being discussed had a much more realistic and a much more powerful application. When he redefined it as intention, redefined karma as intention, now the situation that you have, there is a consequence. Your intention, just as I spoke about earlier, your intention is either going to strengthen your attachment to the notion of self and further enslave you to craving, or it's going to loosen the attachment to self and weaken the power that craving has over you. And that is good and bad karma. That is good and bad karma that manifests in your life. Your actions today create the person that you will be tomorrow and next week and next month. In every present moment, you are creating the karma that is going to manifest in who you are in the future. This is a much more powerful application of the idea of karma. And it loses nothing of the virtue-enhancing result of the other form. Because after all, if we look at those kinds of speech and thought, speech, and action, let's include thought in it, those kinds of thought, speech, and action that we would consider as virtuous, and we compare them to the kinds of thought, speech, and action that we would consider them to be non-virtuous, what we will find at their root are that they come from these two different kinds of intention, wholesome and unwholesome. And their wholesomeness is the degree to which they are denying the demands of the self and the compulsion of craving. And they are unwholesome in the degree to which they succumb to the compulsion of craving, and they cling, they manifest a clinging to self. The idea that I hold myself more dear than anything else in the universe. That's what's reinforced by unvirtuous actions. You'll find that in them. So the Buddha took a rather simplistic idea, but had at its heart a really powerful principle, and applied it in a different way, in a much more effective way. And it allows us to step aside from worrying about future lives and past lives, and focus on moving ourselves towards nibbana, moving ourselves away from the delusion and the entrapment that brings so much suffering into human existence. So karma is very much at the root of TMI, but we just use it in the sense that the Buddha defined it. And I think you'll find that pretty clearly described in the appendix to TMI that is the mindful review. Here's a question from Adrian a week ago. Pain is inevitable, suffering is optional. Hence, pain and suffering are two different things. Yep. At least that's how I define it. I use the word suffering to refer to something different than pain. If we remove the suffering, is pain just a sensation, like the sensations of my back touching the chair, a neutral sensation, or the sensations of a massage, a pleasant sensation? There must be something intrinsic to the sensation that characterizes it as pain, pleasure, or neutral. That is absolutely right, Adrian. You're right on there. Just as for an arhat or a Buddha, there are neutral sensations, there are pleasant sensations, and there are also unpleasant sensations. And when I say pain, use the word pain, I'm referring to unpleasant sensations. They have, it's an unpleasantness, it's the Vedana of dukkha that has its roots, or has its origin in the body. Now there's the mind's reaction to that. So let's see what Adrian says next. If this is true, the suffering that is produced by the reaction to the pain is the only one that can be removed by not having aversion to, and therefore not triggering the suffering. Yes, that's right. The what's called the first noble truth, the truth of suffering, you could sum up, and I like to, as saying pain is inevitable, but suffering is optional. So the unpleasant sensations generated from the nerve endings in your body going to particular centers in your brain are going to be experienced as unpleasant. But the mind's reaction to it acts as a multiplier. So, and it's really, the mind's reaction is a resistance as opposed to an acceptance. So to the degree that you resist pain, you experience suffering. And my friend Shinzen Young has a wonderful little formula, and it's in TMI, and I absolutely love it. That suffering equals pain times resistance. And so it's that mental reaction that produces the suffering. And because it is a multiplication, then it has two interesting consequences. One is that without the resistance, the unpleasantness of pain itself is much, much less. And the other is that if resistance becomes zero, then suffering is zero. So there's still unpleasantness. There's the unpleasantness of the pain itself. And I can tell you from personal experience, that's something that you can just accept and more or less allow to be there and otherwise disregard. But the part that belongs to pain is still there, which contradicts the statement of the beginning. It seems like we are working to remove the layer of suffering that depends on the logic by which we respond to, but there is still another dimension that is unremovable. That is true, but it's not a contradiction. The Buddha did not say that you would not experience pain by following the path that he taught. He said that you would overcome a particular kind of suffering that is generated by the mind and is a reaction of the mind. And traditional Buddhist doctrine teaches, well, not in all schools, but in certainly in the Theravada, and I think in most other schools, it's taught that Buddhas do experience the Vedamas, the feelings of pleasant, neutral, and unpleasant. And so the unpleasantness that they experience is that which is hardwired into our body. And so long as we are in a body, they will be there. They'll be a part of it. But by defining suffering as the mental reaction, we're not contradicting this to say that there's still unpleasant physical sensation. Let's see, I am confused about this, especially if we add the idea of realizing, awakening, or attaining fourth path, which, if properly done, deepening the insight into no self, seems to remove the assumption of being a self, which is the thing that is susceptible to suffering. That shouldn't be troubling. That's exactly right. Yes, that's it exactly. The reactivity, the resistance, is a manifestation of craving, which has its origins in the self, and with a deepening insight to no self, and with the removal of the assumption of being the self, then there is no longer that resistance. There's no longer that reactivity, and there is no longer that suffering. So, does this realization remove the reactions to the pain? Yes. And the part of the suffering that goes with them? Yes, but not the part that is intrinsic to the pain. That's correct. Exactly. So, you figured it out, Adrian. And I could have just skipped to the end of this and said, yes, that's right. Very, very good. Very good. Now, let's see. Crystal Maynard has a question. Have you heard of and or experienced transfer of consciousness occurring between two living adults? If so, from what and to what is the consciousness being transferred? And what is the purpose of the transfer? Well, from what I have learned and from what I have experienced, I have a strong conviction that our minds are connected and they interact other than just through the body, through speech, through physical interactions between them. That, if anything, the individual mind is a kind of porous barrier that filters out enough that a person can experience their individuality, which is a good thing, because if there weren't these barriers, then when you walk out the door in the morning, you might not know whose job to go to or whose car to get into and try to drive. It could be confusing. Have I heard of or experienced transfer of consciousness occurring between two living adults? I have, and that's why I say what I just said. If so, from what and to what is the consciousness being transferred? Well, it's like as the water, as you stir your cup of tea and the water moves and things like that. To what and from what is what being transferred? Well, we could somehow label one group of water molecules and say that's entity A, and then as they become dispersed, they might become part of some other group of water molecules that we might have identified as entity B. What is the purpose of the transfer? It depends on whether it's a purposeful transfer or it just happens. And a lot of times it just happens. It's a very difficult question to answer, because it's sort of the thing that if you haven't had certain kinds of experiences, and if you're attached to a certain view of consciousness, especially a lot of us tend to identify consciousness with self. If we keep pushing, well, is this self? No. Is that self? No. Very often where people end up with is consciousness. Oh, I'm my consciousness. And that is as much an illusion as any other thing that we choose to label as self. So to discuss this particular question meaningfully, there needs to be a commonality of experience, and there needs to be a shared understanding of what consciousness is. And to the degree that a person has reified consciousness, fetishized consciousness, made consciousness into this special, wonderful thing, then it's going to be difficult to communicate about that. I'm going to move on to Andrea's question. I find it concerning that there are so many awakened people who seem to behave poorly in different ways. I like the way awakened is in quotation marks on this, because there are so many different things that people think are awakening. So there are so many awakened people who seem to behave poorly in different ways. At its worst, this bad behavior might involve gross ethical violations, or it might involve grandiosity and potentially abusing the guru-yoga relationship. Or it may just amount to personal blind spots where that person can no longer see their own faults, and they're unlikely to accept feedback on that subject. For example, an Arya might dismiss constructive criticism from someone they see as a worldling, since clearly that person isn't operating on the same level as they are. Now, I would say that that person is manifesting conceit, and an Arya who has become an Arhat would not have those particular conceits. But someone on an earlier path might, and they might have such a conceit that allowed them to take that attitude that I'm wiser and more spiritually developed than this person, and so therefore, what right do they have to criticize the behavior of someone who is as wise as me? That's just an indication of the incompleteness of their own personal spiritual development. Stream entry is a huge transition. It is very transformative, but it's nowhere near the end of the path. There is so much further to go, so much more work that you need to do on yourself. And so someone may be awakened in, and keep in mind there's many different definitions of awakening and many different criteria that people are going to use. So someone may be awakened to some degree by any one of these many criteria, but that does not mean that they're a perfected being in any sense. And so, yes, they have personal blind spots. They have faults. They can have ego attachment. Even though in the four-path model, with the overcoming of the personality view and the realization that there is no separate self, even though one still feels as though they're a separate self, it's less likely that a person who has achieved that type of awakening, according to the four-path model, has become a stream entrant. It's not that they might not manifest these behaviors occasionally, but they can't fail to recognize the deluded and inappropriateness of the behavior they have for very long. So they can slip into old habits of thinking, and that old habit of thinking might allow them to fall into an egotistical judgment state. But if they're truly awakened in the sense that the Buddha defines stream entry, then they're not. That's not going to last very long. It's a descent into samsara that they will arise out of again. What can a practitioner, pre or post awakening, do to keep from falling into that trap? Well, keep on practicing as diligently as you can, and deepen the insights that you have, and deepen your understanding of the Dharma, and practice the Eightfold Path more assiduously than ever. For example, someone could have a highly unified mind except for one heavily fortified area of delusion or bad behavior, i.e. a blind spot. Yes, great example. Someone could have that. They could be first path, second path. They might even be somebody third path with a big blind spot of some particular kind. They might truly come to believe that as a realized bodhisattva, the ordinary rules don't apply to them. Well, see, now that's where I quibble with that. Part of wisdom is realizing what underlies these rules. The rules, ordinary rules, are the tools that we need in the world. But beneath them, what they are is they are an attempt to articulate in a way that can serve as a guidance for our behavior, something that is of a much deeper and more fundamental, that is in a much deeper and more fundamental sense true. And so somebody might have a blind spot, but if they find themselves engaged in that kind of behavior, then they need to acknowledge and accept it and try to find out what that blind spot is. If they just practice, if they continue to practice, then the practice itself will reveal that eventually. So when you find someone who appears to be awakened, but is engaging in kind of behavior that appears to be unethical, then the question you need to ask yourself the question. First of all, it's very difficult to know the motives of someone else. So you have to hold, and also to know how the depth of your understanding compares to somebody else. That doesn't mean that you just blindly accept the behavior of somebody who is in a position of guru or teacher or just presenting themselves as being awakened. You do have a right to question that. And if they will listen to you as a spiritual friend, as a kalyana mita, then you could do them service by bringing their attention to that. I know people who are actually wary of awakening since they don't want to become deluded or grandiose. What is the best way to prevent that? Well, that's, that is, you shouldn't be afraid of awakening because of that. Because if you recognize that that there's a threshold of awakening, and then there's they call these paths. There's a long journey that follows that. And if you continue to follow that journey, then the kinds of problems that we're talking about here wouldn't be so prevalent. What happens is that people often get stuck. They may indeed have achieved a certain degree of awakening, or they may not at all. They may have had some experiences that were very profound. They may be really well versed in the scriptures and the doctrines and the Dharma. They may appear quite wise, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're awakened. They may have had some experiences that are associated with being awakened, some characteristics, but those were temporary and haven't penetrated to the depth of their being, and so that's where the manifestation of these unethical behaviors come from. So the way to avoid that is to realize that stream entry is just the beginning of a much greater path. And as far as I'm concerned, what I've learned is that it doesn't end there. I think the Buddha found it convenient to describe a four-path process terminating with the Arhat. But that's not the end of the process either. And there has been some recognition of that in the Mahayana, but in the idea of the Bodhisattva Bhumis and the idea that perhaps there's something beyond the Arhat.
Thanks so much.
You're welcome. Robert Arnold asks, I'm working with stage 6 practices. In general, I have noticed a change in perception of the breath with the nose. There is a sense of having descended into the sensations, whereas previously there was a spatial sense of distance from the breath. Also, breath sensations associated with the nose seem to manifest in other body locations, despite stable attentional scope with the nose. I have been interpreting this as a conceptual stripping away of the breath experience that is described as a characteristic of the acquired appearance, the Vihanimita. Yes, that is accurate. That's not unusual at all. There's a definite change in the way that you experience the sensations of the breath. Sometimes they seem to be in places that they shouldn't be, and yeah, all of the things that you described, Robert. These are typical stage 6 experiences. Don't get too involved with them, but recognize them for what they are, which is that the way that we normally experience the world is what arises in consciousness is a really very, very highly complex conceptual product of many different aspects of our worldview. What you're experiencing there is what appears in consciousness is being stripped of a lot of this conceptual overlay that constitutes our normal worldview. That you have a nose and that it's located in a particular place is really part of your mind-created worldview. And so it's possible that you will have experiences of breath sensations that arise in consciousness that are not accompanied by the processing of placing those sensations on a map of your body in the way that they normally do. So, yes.
Okay, and just a follow-up to that. So normally with the stage 6 practice, and I'm intending to maintain the scope at the nose, then with that spatial stripping away, it kind of confuses the notion of what it means to limit the scope to some area of the body, because you're experiencing some part of you tells you there's a nose sensation, but it's appearing or seeming to manifest in a place spatially very different. So in terms of scope, do you just not worry about the spatial rules and attend only to the sensation?
Yes, because scope is only partly, only sometimes does scope have a spatial element to it. If the scope of your attention is the sensations of the breath at the nose, eventually you can experience those sensations quite independently of the notion of nose. The spatial, what you've done there is that you have a scope of attention that is no longer including the spatial mapping component, right? Now, when you want to define your scope of attention, then you define a really easy way to do that is to define your scope of attention in terms of a body area, a body part, your hand or something like that, and then look for the sensations that are located in that. So therefore, now you've included a specific spatial location in with the sensations as well. So, so that is that your scope of attention is your hand. Because the scope of your attention is your hand, one of the kinds of sensations that you would experience in your hand that is different than what you would experience at your nose is the proprioceptive experience of the shape of your hand. With your eyes closed and with your hand, you can feel the shape of your hand, the solidity, the earth element of your hand. And so that is, by making that the basis for defining the scope of your attention, then you include those kinds of proprioceptive sensations within the scope of your attention. Now, if you're looking for sensations that change with the breath, it takes many forms in different people, but one of the forms that's fairly common, and it was the reason that I mentioned the earth element of that proprioceptive sensation of the shape of your hand, is if you focus on that, you might discover that with each inhale, there's a sort of expansion that is felt. With each exhale, there's a sort of a contraction. But you could find some similar changing thing with the fire element. For example, the temperature in your hand fluctuates and so forth. When you define the scope of your attention, you may choose to include a part of your body, or there's so many things that you can choose to limit the scope of your attention to. It sounds to me like you're practicing stage 6 very well, very appropriately.
Great, thank you.
David Carpenter asks, although I understand your training is in the Theravada and Tibetan traditions, and thus you have not yourself practiced in Rinzai Zen or used koan, yeah, that's true. I'm wondering if you could comment, based on whatever you may know of koan practice, on its nature and function on the path, and specifically whether you see any parallels between koan practice and the practices in Theravada or Tibetan Buddhism. No, any answer I give to this question, David, is going to be highly speculative. And that would be a speculation based on the experience that I have in my own practice and different forms that they take. Or maybe I could base my speculations on my understanding of the mind. One of the things that I've discovered is that our minds tend to be very much dominated by that one part of our mind that perceives the world in a very reductionistic and analytical way. It breaks the world the world of experience as a continuous whole into discrete parts, and it defines them distinct from each other, and then it further breaks them down into other parts. And it's a wonderful part of our mind for solving problems and inventing things and creating technologies and everything else. But it does so by utilizing a perception that is significantly divorced from the way things actually are. And what I suspect that a koan practice does is that part of your mind works on the koan. If it's a good koan, it works on the koan. It may think it's solved the koan several times and go to the master, and he laughs and sends you off to go back and practice some more. Eventually, what it does is, figuratively speaking, throws up its hands and gives up, and allows that other part of your mind that sees and understands the wholeness of everything, that no longer perceives you the separateness of the body and person that you are, that it provides that breakthrough into the insights of impermanence, interconnectedness, emptiness, of no self, and the realization that you've been making yourself suffer all this time by clinging to things that weren't real, rather than seeing, rather than understanding things in a more realistic way. It's very liberating not to be separate. It's very liberating to be part of something that is far greater. It's very liberating to see yourself as interconnected and a part of everything and everyone everywhere. So that's my suspicion of what the primary function of a koan is. It's something that we achieve with different approaches in various practices in Theravada and Tibetan tradition. But one thing that we have in common is getting beyond, getting out of the prison of our own minds, self-constructed idea of who we are and what the world is and what our relationship to it is, and allows that part of our mind that's already there, call it the Buddha nature if you want, but it's an aspect of human nature, and I do like to call it the Buddha nature. It's an aspect of the nature of every one of us that already knows these truths, that already knows the interconnectedness of everything, that already knows that there really are no things. There is only process. It really knows that we are not separate, that we are a continuously evolving part of this greater process. So those are my thoughts. let's not elevate them to the status of authoritative explanations, please. They're the thoughts and speculations of a practitioner who has only observed this practice with fascination from the outside. So I don't know if that's much use to you, but it was enjoyable talking about it. Would the TMI be approached any differently if one were already a stream enterer? And my answer is no, that to the degree that you achieve stream entry without developing those particular skills that are characteristic of stages 1 to 6, then that would be a really good time to start developing them, because they're going to make a huge difference in terms of your progress through the subsequent higher paths. No matter that you're a stream entrant and have the benefit of insight, that insight is still subject to much deepening and spreading throughout your mind system to many other parts of your mind, to permeating your being. So you don't just realize impermanence. That realization continues to deepen. And doing the practices that are described in stages 7 through 10 will only lead to further deepening of those insights. And really what a lot of the process is too is coming to the realization that although we might list these as separate insights, they're really different aspects of the same thing. So, short answer, would the method TMI be approached any differently if one were already a stream enterer? The main difference, I would hope, would be with greater fervor and dedication. Here's a good question from Kevin Smith. I've heard you comment that the so-called dark night is mitigated by practicing samatha. But does this still mean that someone doing TMI will go through the stages of insight as a dry vipassana practitioner would? The answer is yes, they will go through the stages of insight, but no, not as a dry vipassana practitioner would. You will go through. I mean, what happens with insight is one of the underpinnings of the way that you see and understand the world has been pulled out from under you. Letting go into that new reality that opens the door to is challenging. It's frightening. It's but so you can expect to go through what is being referred to as the in the progress of insight is being referred to as the knowledges of fear, misery, disgust, determination, reobservation. You can expect to go through them, but you won't go through them in the way that a dry vipassana practitioner goes through. You'll go through them in a much more quickly, far more easily, and those stages themselves will serve as powerful sources of further insight. They don't last very long. They can be as short as a moment. And it can be a moment that opens up into into that moment of total equanimity in which the insights stand out to you so clearly that a cessation occurs and you become a stream entrant. You might likely experience, leading up to that, some deep unsettled feeling from your unconscious, because it's really all the different parts of your unconscious mind are struggling to assimilate these insights. and to modify a worldview. But if you've done the kind of work that samatha practice requires of you, it becomes much easier. Now, let me just point out that one of the big, well, a couple of things on. First of all, please, lest none of us equate the knowledges of suffering, the dukkha jnanas of the progress of insight, with what is being described and called the dark night by various people. People are starting to do that. Let's not do that. They're two totally different things. The dark night is a place you go into because you're experiencing the dukkha jnanas without adequate preparation. End of story. What is the biggest part of the dark night, though? One of the things that happens as a part of samatha training is that you work through a huge amount of your own neurosis. You work through a lot of the conditioning that stands in the way of your awakening. You work through a lot of the conditioning that has been causing the suffering that has led you to want to pursue a practice like this. Now, these things want to come up. They want to be worked through in the dry vipassana practice. But when a person gets to them, they're labeled the defilements of insight, and the instruction they're given is to note them and keep practicing. Let them be there. Don't get caught up in them. If in the process of samatha you would have purified this, you will have shed most of your neurosis, you will have shed most of your internal conflicts. Your mind will be much more highly unified than that of a dry vipassana practitioner. And so you can go through this very easily. If you haven't done this purification, if you haven't worked through these things, they all come up when insight comes up. And that's what you've got to work through. That's what launches somebody into a dark night that lasts for long periods of time, that can disrupt their life, that can ruin their relationships, their careers or families. Sometimes they end up in psychiatric hospitals and all kinds of things like that. That's the dark night. That's when something that should never happen has happened because of the way that Westerners in particular apply dry insight practices without really practicing the whole Eightfold Path. And so what you really see when somebody's experiencing a dark night is they're not even in the dukkha jnanas. They got blasted out of the progress of insight by all of the unresolved emotional trauma that they're still carrying, all of the inner conflicts, all of their neurosis is still there, and they got blasted right out of it. So that's what the dark night is. The dark night is not the dukkha jnanas, but the dukkha jnanas can trigger the dark night if somebody hasn't done the appropriate work prior to that. I've also heard Daniel Ingram talk about cycling through the stages repeatedly once on the path, and that it never seems to end. I don't know. I'd have to sit down with Daniel, and actually, it would be interesting to talk to him about this, because once you have, well, once you have realized the fundamental insights to a sufficient degree, and they have penetrated sufficiently deeply into your intuitive understanding of the world, then the mind's reaction to the further deepening of those same insights shouldn't really manifest the characteristics of the dukkha jnanas. I know, well, I do have some students who have the experience of cycling through them repeatedly, but then they've gone and they've done they've also done the Mahasi style Vipassana practice. And in this case, after they'd already done the TMI samatha practice to the point of stage 9 or 10. And it's a funny thing that then they come back and report that they're now experiencing repetitions of all of the stages. And I know in Mahasi's Progress of Insight that he does say that this will happen for each of the path attainments. But this may be a place where there's a divergence in our understandings and what we're talking about, because that doesn't correspond to my experience. And he also spoke of being in the dark night for the majority of his life since awakening. Please, Daniel, I hope that's not true. Not that there aren't no matter what path that you take to achieve stream entry or the path of seeing, you've still got a lot of stuff that hasn't been dealt with. And you're going to still have, there's still going to be some heavy stuff that you have to work through. But I don't know. I certainly wouldn't describe it as being in a dark night all the time, and I would certainly hope that that's not true, Daniel. But next time we get together, we're going to have a talk about that, because that's all I can say. We've gone a bit over time, but we managed to get through all the questions. I'm kind of impressed by that. And if those of you who are present would like to make any comments or add anything to or ask anything further, I don't mind staying for a few minutes longer.
Culadasa, this is Steve Ross.
Yes, Steve.
So I have an early edition of TMI, and I'm wondering, you're referring to first path, second path, third path. I don't recognize these terms from my edition of the book. I just don't recognize that. How does it correspond?
When you say early edition, you're talking about the print book, or there was an online thing that I produced in the summer of 2000 that I put up online in 2006.
Oh, no. I have the first edition of TMI, and I have the little summary.
Well, so far that's the only edition.
Okay.
The Simon & Schuster edition, they just put a different cover, added a preface, and everything else is the same.
Okay.
I don't address that, because that wasn't what I felt was appropriate, and the book was long enough anyway, and it was going to take so much longer to go into that. It would belong. Well, I don't know how many more books I have in me, and the one book that I do want to get out of me is one contemporary Dharma. And so maybe that's these discussions about the four paths, and really discussions comparing the different versions of awakening, enlightenment, etc., and so on. Because those are discussions that I'd like to have, but they're not the kind of thing that I can sit down and punch out a book for you to read. But we can create.
I wasn't familiar with those terms, and it sounded almost like everyone should be familiar with those terms. That's all.
Well, by all means, everybody should be, but it's quite understandable if you aren't. These come from, if you study, the Dharma, and if you read the suttas, then the four paths are described by the Buddha in the suttas. They're defined, and usually they come up in any kind of Dharma teaching because they're a really important part of it.
Hi, Culadasa.
But
This is
yeah,
Jhana here. And I sent a question last night because I wasn't quite sure how the Q&A worked. And do you have that in front of you?
let me go back because I didn't see one. I went through. I don't think I missed.
Nancy just added it to the list because I sent it because I didn't see it. And it's a question, I can tell you, so you don't have to read through it because it's...
Okay, sounds good.
I'll make it brief. It's a question about the first luminous jhana meditation.
Yes.
And for years, I've had this experience when meditating of a disc, like a purple light rotating in when my attention was focused on the third eye region.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm now reading stage 8, and that's why this has come up, and it's so interesting that this meeting came up just now, because I was really not sure who to ask. And the question that I have really is this experience, and in the last few days I've been going through a cleanse and a purification, and I've been having very powerful insights. And often this rotating disc will become an eye. And the most interesting thing I think you said in the stage 8, what you've written, is that this is an internally generated phenomenon, which as a neurologist is fascinating to me because, of course, visual stimuli are typically needed. And so then I suddenly thought, oh my goodness, this is something that I've never had an answer from many people that I've asked about. And we discussed about the meditative joy experiences that I've had, which have been really powerful. And in that experience, I would often have the sense of a brilliant, like present moment being this brilliant, multifaceted experience based on the sense inputs. And it was rotating in this light, and it was a very powerful, blissful state. And today my meditation on the luminous jhana was even deeper because I really experienced that sense of lightness, of loss of the sensory inputs, and just a feeling of very airy but focused. So I wonder if you could help me with this.
Well, help you in which way? It sounds like you're having deepening. The thing is, the deepening of jhana is closely related to the withdrawal of the mind from the senses. The more complete the withdrawal of the mind from the senses is. And of course, so what happens is that you get these mind-generated phenomena arising. To the degree that your mind is withdrawn from the senses, you enter a deeper jhana, much, much clearer. And so this is completely normal and desirable to happen. Practicing the jhanas means dropping the attention and experiencing the mind very much from a metacognitive perspective awareness. And that's the wonder of the
So
jhana.
it doesn't have to be a white light or anything else. This phenomenon.
Not at all. It doesn't have to be. It doesn't have to be any particular thing. There's certain common trends. A white light is, or a very bright light. I mean, in my case, it's usually lavender. Faint lavender, almost white, but very bright. Some people, it's a disc. And of course, there are other ways of entering jhana that utilize vision, like the Cocina practices. And there you'll definitely get some very interesting visual effects and lights and colors and things like that. Kind of an aside, but some of us have been stimulated by Daniel Ingram to try out the fire Cocina practice. That's a really interesting one. You stare at a candle for a long time till you've completely depleted the photoreceptors in the fovea of your eye. And then you close your eye and you work with an after image. And then after the after image finally fades, you go into kind of a murky place where lights and colors start to appear. And one of the things that I haven't experienced this myself, but one of the things that someone else had discovered was that after you do this for hours every day, you start having visual hallucinations when you're walking around outside and things like that, which is really disconcerting. So she decided to Google it and came up with Charles Bonnet syndrome, which I'm sure you're familiar with, right? In the context of people who are developing macular degeneration, they start to have these very vivid hallucinations. Well, I mean, staring at a candle over and over again until you've depleted the retinal pigments, and doing that over and over again for hours, days in a row, that's about as close as you can come to a self-induced macular degeneration, and so you get Charles Bonnet syndrome.
Well,
Anyway,
today's
all kinds of
experience-
things that arise. Yeah.
Today's experience was fascinating because it brought up the memory of the cessation experience that I had, where the mind was completely still and the sun was shining brilliantly in a clear blue sky. And it made me think that the sun, in so many ways, ultimately is what we can really, what for me has become now a very powerful mentally generated image. It's not looking at the sun, but realizing that this brilliant, beautiful, extraordinary light is just something that can be used. That there's no striving anymore in this brilliant luminosity. That the sun now, that realization today was very, very powerful. And I wondered if you had any thoughts about that.
It sounds right on to me. I don't know what else to say. It sounds like a beautiful experience and a very profound kind of realization. Yeah.
Thank you.
I don't know what else to say. Nancy had a question. You have to unmute, Nancy.
I was just, I just posted his question that he had sent to me privately.
Oh.
So I put it on the chat. So you've already
Okay.
answered it.
Actually, once you started describing it, I recognized I had read the email, and I had meant to. It had slipped my mind to go to the email that contained it, or was it a chat that can? So anyway, I think it was in an email, and I was just going by the comments that were on the Patreon page, so that's why I missed it. I'm sorry. Anyone else want to say anything? Otherwise, this might be a good time to wrap up. What's that?
Hello, Culadasa.
Hello. Yes, hi, Matthias.
Can you please talk about the connection between concentration in real life and meditation?
Concentration.
Outside of meditation and inside of meditation.
Well, I'm afraid that's a little too general. I need a place to.
So if someone improved their concentration by a lot in meditation, will that have spill over to things that require concentration in real life, and how much, and so on?
Most definitely, it will, and so will the increased power of awareness. So yeah, it is normal if you're practicing to experience greatly improved concentration and much more powerful awareness outside of meditation. But it's also important to cultivate the awareness aspect. The concentration aspect is going to take care of itself because it's attention based, and if anything, we are overly caught up in attention, and we're suffering an awareness deficit disorder. So you can let the improved concentration of your meditation spill over in your daily life, and it'll take care of itself by accident. What you want to put a little intentional work into is bringing that heightened level of awareness that you have in meditation into your daily life.
Thank you.
Welcome. Okay, well, great. I enjoyed this, and thank you for joining me today, and thank you most especially for your contributions to Patreon. And here is one of the fruits of that, Nick Perry, who is my personal assistant. Some of you know Nick. I'm so blessed to have him, and I have you people and your contributions to thank for the fact that he's here. But thank you for your questions. They're good ones. I hope you found the answers beneficial and useful in some way. And I look forward to next time. So until then.